Right, so today's video is a bit of an interesting one, mainly for a couple of reasons, because I wasn't planning on making a video on this computer, but I think it answers quite an interesting question, because last week we got a bundle of 1156 components, which cost me £11.50, and it got me thinking, can we do anything with those parts? Where is the limit with 1156? Because it's getting on a little bit now. So I've thrown together what is probably a good example of what you can upgrade 1156 into. So we've added a £5 Core i7, which you can grab off the shelf anywhere. I've added an R9 285 graphics card that I had lying around. These are about £20 to £25. They are genuinely in the bargain bin at the moment. It is actually my old graphics card. And I've increased it to 16GB of RAM, which I just ordered off AliExpress. So all in all, we're talking about £30 worth of components to see maybe if there's any life left in 1156 and if it's worth not buying into, but maybe upgrading an older system you have. Now, this example of a computer is probably a bit overkill. I mean, you don't need water cooling, but we have an all-in-one cooler in here, RGB, the full works, because you can actually still make them look rather nice. And this thing here is running dead cool. It's been running a stress test for a little while, and it doesn't get hot, it doesn't get noisy, and it does still have a lot of modern features. We have it here running Windows 11, so the question today is going to be, is 1156 dead? And do you really need to move on from the first generation of Core i stuff from Intel?
So it's worth starting off by saying that these upgrades really are affordable to just about anyone left on the platform, and maybe to some of those that are on a really tight budget and are actually considering LGA 1156. Because as much as it's getting on in years, well, we've seen it crop up a few times on the channel recently, and it does always turn around and surprise us. Comparing the system before and after the upgrades though, we jumped from a score of 1750, which was the original components all overclocked to the 9s, up to a score of just over 7000, and this was in Firestrike on 3D Mark, so relatively intensive benchmark. And that was handily beating similar systems when we compared it against an AMD 4-core FX chip, and even going as far as beating Intel Skylake i3s. I mean, it's nothing too surprising, but as I said, this was my old graphics card, so I happen to have 10 years worth of benchmarks with this R9 285 on hand, so plenty to compare to. So even from the get-go, we can see that 1156 is still beating some systems that we've already seen are more than passable in the modern day. But one major downside that I immediately bumped into here on 1156 is this used to be the platform of overclocking. You bought a system like this cheap and you overclocked it. And I mean, we did the same last week where we bumped up that Core i3 that came with the system from 2.8 GHz to 4.4 GHz, with very little time actually spent on the overclocking process. But here with this Core i7, well, the reality is that a lot of these higher end chips, which have become very cheap because it's the best you can buy for this platform, well, someone's already been here and done that, and with how cheap they've gotten over the years, it had an attitude brought about that was just bung as much voltage into it as possible till it was stable, and enjoy it till you couldn't anymore. And that was about the attitude that most people had. I mean, I don't really blame them because these things were cheap, and it means that a lot of the stock of chips of these out there are degraded so much that they simply won't budge from their stock clocks anymore. And this isn't something I've seen just happen once. I've seen it happen with a few 1156 chips that I've tested. But over here with our CEX Special Core i7, well, we could just about manage a 3.3 GHz overclock at most. But the system would then blue screen due to instability, and trust me, I spent a good couple of hours tweaking things around and seeing if we could get any extra performance out of this, and sadly, no, there was nothing we could do to actually bump up the clocks. The only thing we could do was increase the multiplier by 1, which means it now runs at 2.93 GHz, which is a 103 megahertz increase. It's not very much, but it's something. And at least it beats some of the other budget alternatives because it does have 4 cores and 8 threads. So there is some positivity to this. And some of you keen-eyed viewers may have noticed that despite this being the same R9 285 graphics card that's appeared on the channel countless times over the years, well, the good news is that our graphics score has actually increased over the years, And is there any particular reason why? Well, despite the fact that AMD's GCN architecture did actually have really rather decent drivers from the get-go, despite being dumped by AMD far too soon, the community has done a really rather good job and actually trying to support GCN. So I did go through and install the latest kernel and latest NimeZ drivers, which once again are as rock solid as they've ever been. I think they're under a different name now, but they gave us some up-to-date drivers, nothing too modern, but at least a step above what AMD offers on their website. And they offer a little bit of extra performance completely for free. All you have to do is download the drivers and run them, which on a 20 quid graphics card, any free performance is of course good performance. Now, it's also worth noting that I've gone through the benchmarks to make the experiences here as playable as possible on the machine, and that doesn't necessarily mean we're aiming for the highest frame rates, because that can lead to some instability and weird frame times. So I've gone through and chosen the best settings configurations, and in most instances I've capped the frame rate to give us a smooth experience, because ultimately if you're playing on your PC, you want the settings and frame rate caps that give you the smoothest way of playing it. What's the point of playing at 40 FPS rather than 30 FPS if the frame rate is all over the place? It's just not enjoyable. So I've gone through and I've tried to show you just what this PC can achieve when you optimize it for running games. So to recap, we've taken out a bundle from last week that cost us £11.50, we've added a cheap Core i7, we've replaced the RAM with 16GB of DDR3 clocking in at 1600MHz, and we've replaced the aging HD 5750 with the slightly less aging AMD Radeon R9 285. And it's time to find out if doing 30 quid's worth of upgrades is enough to save LGA 1156 and the first generation of Core i stuff from obsolescence, whatever you want to call it, in the benchmarks. Starting off the benchmarks, we have The Sims 4, which is the main thing this PC is probably only ever going to be playing, because I am not keeping this computer. And it's nice to know that with ultra settings in 1080p, well, even in a full household, with ultra settings in 1080p, you're going to be seeing over 60 FPS a lot of the time. Generally, this could go down to the mid-40s when you were using the 3x speed up option, and things were going all over the place, and there were lots of Sims in the household, and I will admit, the i7 did take a little bit of a beating here. But it was still fine. We were still seeing more than playable frame rates, and that was even in a big house with lots of people and lots of things happening. Generally, when you were in smaller households and smaller situations, you'd be seeing well into the hundreds of FPS, so you are more than able to cap the frame rate here. Generally though, Sims 4 ultra settings, completely playable at 1080p, and you could probably push it up to 4K on this graphics card and still see no slowdown. GTA 5 with the Enhanced Edition here actually ran really well with pretty much a constantly locked 30 FPS, and you're probably seeing that GPU utilization at 100%, and that is the reason for the mixture of settings. See, because we only had 2GB of VRAM, which really is the Achilles heel of the R9 285, it meant that we did have to use normal textures. But it did mean that with some of the lighting effects and some of the other effects going on, we could use a mixture of high and ultra settings to get a really smooth experience. Now, we did have to cap the frame rate at 30 FPS, which was the easiest way to keep the game running smooth, as if we didn't do this, the game did become a little bit stuttery in places, but as long as we had that frame rate cap in place, we didn't drop hardly any frames. It was only on a very rare occasion we saw it drop down to 29 FPS. So GTA 5 Enhanced Edition was very playable, very enjoyable, and looked great on what is still quite an old-based system. Now, over in the world of GTA Online, which we are testing with the older release of GTA 5 because I've not set myself up to benchmark the new release of GTA Online yet, but it's worth noting here that a lot of people are still playing this version, so it was worth us testing it here. And it does still struggle with the performance, because GTA Online, I've not tested the new version, but the old version we usually see is a complete optimization mess these days, where we had to cap the frame rate at 30 FPS, and admittedly, it did run well, and we were seeing no issues with frame times, and we did run the game with a mixture of high and ultra settings with the AMD CHS Shadows option, which is a nice option that you don't see in the newer version. It looked great, it ran well, but you did have to ensure you had a 30 FPS cap in place to make this playable, which seems ridiculous because the actual standard version of the game can run at 60 FPS, so it was worth us noting that it does run, but it is still remarkably intensive on a system like this, where utilization just doesn't work properly. Mount & Blade Bannerlord we did run with a mixture of medium and high settings in 1080p, and conveniently this game is so well optimised that with the Core i7-860, even at stock clocks, we were able to run the game at a virtually locked 60 FPS. Now don't get me wrong, during the late game and very big benchmarks you could see this drop, but for most of the game and the in-game benchmark, we were seeing 60 FPS throughout the entire thing. Now, we were not in any position to really test it with higher settings, but when you do, it did drop the performance quite dramatically. High and ultra settings on the R9285 quickly became the limiting factor, so it was nice to see that you could actually upgrade your graphics card, go with settings even higher, and still see a remarkably smooth experience. Red Dead Redemption 2 is a complete nightmare to benchmark, because even on graphics cards that should run it absolutely fine with like the R9285, the game has no built-in option to ignore the VRAM limits, and it greatly over-exaggerates about the amount it wants to use. So it meant that I constantly had to go out of the game, change files in the config, as in the old CFG file to change the settings, and eventually get us down to a set of settings that will actually work, where we were running with a mixture of low textures, medium settings, and high shadows and lighting effects, which meant the game did look rather nice. Now, it did only run at 30 FPS, and that was a limit of the R9285, because even though I want to ignore the VRAM limits, you can still quite easily surpass 2GB here when you're using a higher resolution. It's why we had to drop down to 900p. Now, the game is beautifully optimised, it just tends to really struggle on these cards that do have under 2 gigs of VRAM. Hitman 3 ran absolutely fine with 30 FPS in 1080p with mostly medium settings. Now, at the end of the benchmark sections in both of them, our actual average frame rate was 29.95, to give you an idea of how close this stuck to 30 FPS all of the time. Now don't get me wrong, it could drop down in some of the more intensive places, but I left it running this benchmark loop for quite a while just to get an average idea of the performance. And once again, the R9285 became a limit much before the Core i7 did, which really seems insanity given that this i7 is one of the original Core i7s, and there's still headroom to go in terms of graphical upgrades. So Hitman 3 was perfectly playable, and you have room for expandability here as well. Now here in Cyberpunk, you're probably looking at this benchmark footage on screen now and seeing a locked 30 FPS, and then thinking that looks great, that doesn't look like low and medium settings, that looks far higher settings than that, and we're seeing 30 FPS locked. Unfortunately in Cyberpunk, the benchmark tends to be a little bit too optimistic, because despite the fact the benchmark could run at a virtually locked 30 FPS and was absolutely fine, the actual gameplay became a little bit of a mess. When you're actually doing something intensive, which is how I like to benchmark Cyberpunk because a lot of the time there's chaos going on, you were seeing anywhere from 16 to 22 FPS. And it wasn't the Core i7 causing this, it was the R9285. It was likely a mixture of VRAM issues and API support, but ultimately it meant that you'd need a better graphics card than what we've put in here to actually play Cyberpunk, but I reckon that i7 could just about manage it. Now, Counter-Strike 2 was never going to be a fully competitive experience here. Let's be honest, the processor really isn't up to providing super high frame rates, but what it can do is with competitive settings, which is the same competitive settings we've used for years, which is low everything and then high shadows, it meant that we saw 89 FPS on average, which would drop down to 63 FPS when there were lots of smokes, flames and effects going on. Now, actual gameplay could see frame rates higher than this because it is a lot less intensive than the benchmark I use, but to give you an idea of the worst case scenario you'll be seeing in Counter-Strike 2, you'll be seeing the game looking fairly decent, to be honest, because even with these settings it does look good, and you'll be seeing just under 90 FPS a lot of the time, and just over 60 FPS when a lot is going on. To be fair though, we have been testing a lot of brand new games on the system, and ones that are quite intensive. When you go back just a few years to the likes of Skyrim Anniversary, you are going to be seeing high and ultra settings in 1080p, with plenty of headroom left over on the processor, keep in mind, and it's going to run perfectly. Skyrim Anniversary here, it didn't matter what we did. If we were in a town and city, if we're out about doing whatever we needed to do, the game ran perfectly fine at a virtually constantly locked 60 FPS. Now it is a Bethesda game, so it is going to pivot away from this for random reasons, but it ran perfectly. So it gives you an idea, for classic titles, 1156 is still fine because it was back when these came out. BeamNG did require us to use a mixture of low and medium settings, but once again I feel like an idiot putting an R9 285 in this system because the Core i7 in here was absolutely fine. No, we genuinely were only seeing 30 to 40% utilization when lots was going on. It did take a little while for the system to load things in, as BeamNG always does on older processors, but once it was up to the graphics card was seeing 100% utilization. It was still able to churn out 60 FPS constantly with a decent set of looking settings. I mean, look how the game looks. It does look brilliant with these settings, and that was with some options set to low. So really, better graphics card, you could get better settings here, and LGA 1156 is still handling BeamNG fine. Baldur's Gate 3 though does definitely have problems with GCN, and it is still rather intensive on the Core i7 because you'll see utilization here, even when trying to target 30 FPS, does really suffer. Now, I'm not going to blame this entirely on the 1156 platform, because AMD does have a little bit to answer for here, because with some proper drivers that were actually provided by AMD, if Vulkan support here actually worked, we'd be seeing a much better frame rate with much better settings. The sad reality is, as good as the NimeZ drivers are, they don't quite fix Vulkan support for these older cards in this game. It'll launch and you'll see a perfectly smooth frame rate with perfect optimization on the graphics card and processor, and you'll think, wow, these old graphics cards are doing great. And then after about 30 seconds it will crash. I've tried this on an R9 285, I've tried this on a HD 7870, there's just no way to get this playable, and frankly the DirectX 11 performance is so dire you might as well not even bother playing the game. Minecraft though, well, even the latest release from 2025 you can run with fast settings and 8 chunks and see virtually 50 FPS on average. I don't know why Minecraft decided it wanted to cap itself to 50 FPS here. I didn't set a 50 FPS cap, but it was running fine and I didn't see any real reason to change it because it was sticking to it quite nicely and we were still seeing a decent amount of utilization. The biggest takeaway is that for Minecraft and those simpler titles, these are still ideal systems for someone to use just for playing games like that. You know, The Sims 4, Minecraft, things like that are going to run perfectly. And yes, if you really wanted to, you can turn up the settings and you can turn up the shaders and the effects and it will still run. And really, once again, the R9 285 became the limit here because it was the hottest this card actually got. Utilization didn't drop below 100 the entire time. It was trying that hard with shaders that it means that you could really go higher if you wanted to play Minecraft with shaders on a system like this. It's a bit of a ridiculous use case, but it goes to show Minecraft, you can make it easy to run, you can make it intensive to run, and it will still just about be hanging in there. So overall in the benchmarks, I mean, I was quite impressed. Generally, with a capped frame rate, we went from seeing our CPU being limited in older, more single-core bound titles, to the actual graphics card becoming our main limit in Cyberpunk 2077 and Baldur's Gate 3. And it's probably down to drivers and VRAM and a mixture of both of them, but the main takeaway from this is, as long as you're happy with a capped but stable frame rate, there is very little stopping you from actually adding an even better graphics card than this to the original Core i7. And it was seriously so odd seeing these brand new titles and they're just crying out for more power on the graphics card. Yet with the processor only having to provide 30 FPS or so, it was fine. It had plenty of headroom. You could probably push it up higher. I mean, the R9 285 here does support FreeSync, so you could get away with an even smoother experience than this, provided you're running with a FreeSync monitor, which is ridiculous that you could be seeing a genuinely smooth and playable frame rate in modern games. You just need something more powerful than the R9 285, and you're going to end up with something even better. I mean, that doesn't take away from the fact that 285 as a graphics card is still a cracking bargain at the moment, but Polaris would make a lot of sense here, maybe even AMD's Vega with how cheap those cards are getting at the moment, and I'm sure the Nvidia alternatives are still viable. Although, on an older system like this, you are usually better using AMD, because the Nvidia stuff does have a slightly bit higher sort of driver overhead going on. I mean, it's not enough to really make a difference here, because that was back in the Core 2 Duo and Core 2 Quad days. We've got 4 cores with hyperthreading, and generally they can handle more intensive drivers. But still, the big takeaway here is 1156, as long as you optimised the settings you were using and decided on a nice capped frame rate, could manage even more than this. And when you compare the performance of this system when it was stock, and then after we added £30 worth of upgrades, the difference becomes even more pronounced. I mean, take GTA 5 for example. It didn't run badly, and we managed a good settings and good resolution, but we ended up with an even smoother experience in the newer, enhanced version with a lot more settings turned up to high. And no, we weren't ever going to be seeing 60 FPS here. But with a budget like this, we're competing with the Xbox One, and it certainly looks and runs a lot nicer over here on the computer than it does on the Xbox One. If anything newer than that, well, we went from games either not running at all or running fairly poorly with lower settings, all the way to playing most games in full HD with high settings. I mean, they were mixed settings a lot of the time with medium and high, but it's still really nice to see that we could actually still push a little bit more life on these older systems without too much hassle. And this was just a case of buying what parts were available. I didn't spend much time looking, it was just a case of going online and seeing what was cheap and was available. That's all I did. You could get even better deals than this. So there we have it, Intel's LGA 1156, and it's been given another chance in 2025. And where do my thoughts honestly lie? Well, as a positive, things in this video, if you already have the parts lying around, or you bought the parts cheap like I did, you can do something with them and you can upgrade them. But on the other hand, unless you are getting them like this, there is very little reason to be looking to build any budget system around this socket like this in 2025. I mean, AM4 is hitting rock bottom prices in the used market, X99 systems on AliExpress are coming in dirt cheap, and something I will look at if people want me to, and if we're talking about the dirt cheap side of the market, well, LGA's 1155, Sandy Bridge and Ivy Bridge, they are now worthless. You can get them for the same price if not cheaper than this, so more performance for less. And yes, you miss out on things like overclocking and a few things like that, but I think we've reached the point where it's time to say that although 1156 is still hanging in there, you shouldn't go out and buy a system just because you thought it'd be a good budget system to build. I mean, sure, with a 30 FPS target in place, it's good for a few more years, and if you're serious about building a budget PC, then spend a little bit more and get a whole lot more out of it. But if this is all you have, and upgrading a system like this is your only choice, well, it does go to show. If you get some RAM, get a graphics card, get the best Core i7 or Xeon you can find, and just enjoy the PC you have and the fact it's still hanging in there, even for the latest of titles, just as long as you temper your expectations, then you can still get a lot of life out of 1156. And I think that's the main takeaway I want to have from this video, is as much as I'm saying don't go out and buy an 1156 system, if you have one and you want to still do something with it, you still can. There are limits to how much you can upgrade it, but with a 30 FPS target and newer titles, you can still enjoy brand new games and go with a rather decent graphics card. We were limited here. But anyway, that's the positive note. Please don't buy 1156 is the more negative note, but just enjoy what you can if you have it and upgrade it as far as you want to. I hope you've all enjoyed this video. Thank you all very much for watching, and good night.